Well, we're all getting used to this virtual environment of learning, and I hope that in the next few weeks, as we start to look at the set text of John Stuart Mill's On Utilitarianism, that we will become quite proficient and fluent with lots of different varieties of utilitarianism. And so what I want to do is just to introduce you to several of the major strands of utilitarianism. And I think this highlights a point that Alistair MacIntyre makes in A Short History of Ethics, where he says there's no problem which Benthamite utilitarianism raises, which is not raised within the utilitarian tradition itself. And the burden of these problems fell on John Stuart Mill. There are lots of solutions that utilitarianism provides in dealing with ethics, but it also throws up lots of problems. And different versions of utilitarianism attempt to solve these problems. Another really great point is made by John Rawls in his lectures on political philosophy about Mill. And he says, Mill thought that modern society would be democratic and industrial and secular, one without a state religion. He hoped to formulate the fundamental principles for such a society. So what Mill wants to do is to kind of work with people of combination, people who have the power of combination. That's the wealthy, those that have access to parliamentary MPs and the legislative process, policymakers, judges. He's from childhood been sort of engineered by his father, who very much believed that people were blank slates and you could shape them. He's been engineered to become an architect of utilitarianism in the political sphere. And so utilitarianism is also a very practical movement, and it has a political edge. It's kind of there at the birth of the modern state. France and America, 1789, are kind of beginning around this time, and utilitarianism is speaking into that world where you look at sum total happiness. You kind of try and aggregate goods as you bring in taxes and you decide on policies to bring as much happiness and minimize as much suffering as you can. Rawls also says, in studying the works of leading writers, one guiding principle is to identify the problems that they were facing. Look at how they viewed them and what questions they were asking. And that's a really good tip whenever you're looking at a philosopher. What's getting them riled, and what do they see in the landscape of ideas that they want to clear out the way and begin again with? So what we need to do is to look at utilitarianism in context, in history, and to see how it was trying to influence lawmakers and judges. Mill himself writes, no reason can be given why the general happiness is desirable except that each person, insofar as he believes it attainable, desires his own happiness. This being a fact provides us with all the proof that we need. So utilitarianism, as the word utility implies, is about usefulness. This is not high-minded stuff. It's not about divine revelation. It's not about rights grounded in natural law. It's about observing psychology. People orientate themselves towards happiness, and they're repelled by pain that's unnecessary and pointless. And this observation should ground us. If we believe in the equal consideration of interests, we should try and maximize the aggregate, the sum total of happiness and welfare in society. I think what I want you to get from this overview of lots of different types of utilitarianism is just how adaptive it is. Now, at points, you can find different types of utilitarianism that flat out contradict one another. But we're going to look at how it evolves and it resolves some of the problems that it raises in utilitarianism Mark I, as it were, Benthamite utilitarianism. So the first view is hedonic utilitarianism. Hedon is a unit of pleasure, and it's used in economics to kind of weigh up pleasures against one another. And there are proto-utilitarians in this. David Hume says that he's a sentimentalist. He says that human beings are passional rather than rational, that we are shaped by our desires and reason kind of comes in afterwards. And Hobbes too thinks that human beings are not at all rational, and they're kind of proto-utilitarians. And Bentham says famously that nature has placed us under the governance of two sovereign masters, pleasure and pain. He has 58 synonyms, similar words for pleasure. And he comes up with his calculus of felicity. So he's scientific. He uses the words kind of plus and minus and equals and aggregates. He's mathematical about how you calculate pleasure. You look at the fecundity. Will this pleasure lead to future pleasures? If you get an education in literacy, then you can read books and that will lead to lots of future pleasure. Whereas if you drink alcohol, then the more of it you drink, the less pleasure that derives from that. It's a diminishing law of returns. How many people are affected? The extent, duration, how long will it go on for? Purity. Do you feel a sense of doing the right thing? You know, does it lead you to a clear conscience, as it were? Although Bentham wouldn't have much truck with the idea of a conscience. Propinquity, how close or remote is it to you? Intensity, is the pleasure immense and intense and possibly temporary? How sure are you that this pleasure is guaranteed? So Bentham writes, the question is not can they reason nor can they talk, but can they suffer? And that's interesting because it then includes animals in the equation. Mill defines Bentham's philosophy as the first principles, that happiness, meaning that term, pleasure and exemption from pain, is the only desirable thing in itself. It's the means. Everything else is a means to that end. So Bentham and Miller agreed that pleasure is the focus of morality. Now, there are some problems with this, and the problems are put on the left and the solutions on the right. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time talking about Benthamite and Mill's utilitarianism, because I think you'll cover those quite adequately, but there's lots of information about them there. I want to focus more on perhaps less well-known variants of utilitarianism. The first is virtue or eudaimonic utilitarianism. Now, John Stuart Mill, of course, read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and in them there's this broader idea of pleasure, which is eudaimonia, flourishing, happiness. In fact, pleasure is not really an end goal for Aristotle at all. And Mill was no fool. He read Aristotle and he understood him, and he's got a lot that's in common with Aristotle. In fact, he's quite influenced by him. Some would say he is into eudaimonia and willing to broaden out his vision of pleasure. He says the ingredients of happiness are very various, and each of them is desirable in itself, and not merely when considered as swelling and aggregate, a sum total of happiness. These may include music, virtue, friendship. It is true that Mill must connect all of these goods back to pleasure or exemption from pain and fit them inside happiness. Now, here's a little comparison. For Aristotle here, all of the goods, I'll just extend this and make this a little bit bigger. For Aristotle, all of the goods are kind of ends in themselves, and they're all waypoints along the route to your general eudaimonia, human flourishing. Whereas for Mill, each of these is kind of evaluated in their capacity to develop happiness or avoid pain. So virtue and friendship are all really about that. And so he's got a problem. How do you reconcile the idea that virtue is desired for itself with the idea that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only desirable things as ends in themselves, are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or a means of promoting pleasure and avoiding pain? And by arguing that since virtue is desired as its own end, it must be part of happiness. That's how he kind of gets around that. He sees that there is a need for a more integrated account of happiness that Aristotle provides. But he doesn't want to stray too far from the observation of human nature right in front of you. You know, what do people orientate themselves towards? So Aristotle wrote widely about pleasure and pain as well, so we shouldn't ignore that. Now, there are problems here with this eudaimonic version of utilitarianism. And that is, first of all, the virtues are ends in themselves for Aristotle. And yet, virtues are only useful insofar as they maximize general utility, general happiness. If it so happened, for instance, that integrity and truth-telling and loyalty weren't particularly helpful to the general good, then they would have lesser value. And virtue ethics wants to put the virtues front and center stage and say we should train character, and character will take care of the decision-making process, whereas utilitarianism almost thinks that character will just happen naturally, it'll just take care of itself, and the real thing is what you do when you act, the decision-making. But we all know that character doesn't take care of itself. By habituation you become, you need training, and children need to have virtues instilled at them. So that's a problem for utilitarianism. Roger Crisp also questions this idea, because Mill borrows some of Aristotle's ideas, and this borrowing may reveal not only why Aristotle and Mill's view converge, but why they diverge. Mill's happiness is more directly related to pleasure. His view is more restricted than Aristotle's. For Mill, must connect every good act back to pleasure or the exemption of pain. Aristotle, on the other hand, can give a more encompassing long-term view of happiness. So that's a brief outline of eudaimonic happiness. Let's go on to ideal utilitarianism now. This is a slight variant, and it's quite straightforward, really. It's really the idea that there are some things that are intrinsically good, whether or not people desire them. You know, if I look at the Mona Lisa, the great art of the world, it's not necessarily good because people pay money for it or go to museums to view it. It could be good in and of itself. And equally, sadistic pleasure, you know, people getting pleasure from torturing animals or watching blood sports, is wrong in and of itself, regardless of the fact that it brings pleasure to people. So we could look at ideals like friendship or beauty or virtue, and we need to ask precisely what value we attribute to these. So the ideal utilitarian would be someone like Hastings Rashtel or G. Moore. They take this view, and Moore, of course, brought his naturalistic fallacy in. He says people often point to something in nature and say, that's pleasure, or that's good, rather, in nature. And if that were true, that you could just point to something in nature and say, that is what we mean by good, then it would be like asking a closed question. Goodness and the thing pointed to would be one and the same. It would be like saying, is good good? But it's not the case when you look at something like pleasure and you say, what is good? Good is what brings about pleasure. That's an open question. But is pleasure always good? You could find instances in which pleasure was bad, like, as we've said, sadistic pleasure, the torturer's pleasure or the bully's pleasure. Is that intrinsically bad? That would be a problem. So ideal utilitarianism wants to pick up on this sense that there are some things that are intrinsically right or wrong. And it has the advantage that it recognizes that there's quite a wide range of goods and bads. We should maximize these ideals of friendship, virtue, and truth telling. It doesn't want to just lump all goods into one scale of pleasure and pain and say everything can be weighed up on that basis. A problem with this is that really you have to, if you're a politician, make tough decisions, and you can't just say, well, we've got this tax budget and we have these demands and we're going to treat every individual case on its own merits. That's the nature of your job, scarcity. You have to get the Treasury to give you, economic projections about how much you've got to spend this year. Sometimes you're going to have to make very tough decisions, and ultimately you're going to weigh things up in terms of pleasure and pain. So as we've said, utilitarianism is born for this, the birth of the bureaucratic state, and many would see it not as a moral philosophy, but as a decision mechanism, a way of allowing politicians and policymakers to weigh up one consequence over another and decide which is for the greatest good of the greatest number, the pursuit of pleasure, the avoidance of pain. So we need to forgo ideals and live in the practical world. Now, another really important movement is preference utilitarianism. This is due to, well, two main advocates of it would be R.M. Hare, who tutored Peter Singer at Oxford for his master's degree. And R.M. Hare, he'd been a Japanese prisoner of war in the Second World War. And when he returned to Oxford, there were lots of logical positivists and emotivists who said that, well, morality, there's no objectivity in it. It's just a matter of taste and feelings. And when people exchange words and argue about morality, essentially they're just sharing their feelings with each other. Well, Hare wanted to bring a greater role for reason into this. He accepted that you couldn't prove morality in the way that you could prove science or scientific claims, but he wanted to give a greater role for reason. And so in doing so, what he says is that you can try and adopt the impartial standpoint of the universe. He uses the term archangel. You kind of stand above the fray, you try and take an impartial point of view, and whatever you choose to do, you try and act consistently, you try and be as informed as possible, and you try and take Kant's universalizability test. Can this be rolled out, this way of living your life, can it be rolled out universally, and will it maximize good when you do so? So where does preference utilitarianism come in this system? Well, the point is that rather than going with kind of pleasure and pain as your kind of objective measures of right and wrong, preference utilitarianism accepts that you probably won't get an objective account of right or wrong, but what you can do is to try and maximize people's choices, freedoms, and their ability to exercise those freedoms in society. After a war where lots of freedoms were overridden, this was an obvious thing to be aiming for. Now, Singer has extended this idea of preference satisfaction, which actually comes from economics as a term, and it's about meeting consumer demand. And I suppose one problem for utilitarianism is the problem that one man's meat is another man's poison. What is pleasure? What is pain? Some people might think running a marathon or trekking to the South Pole is hellish. Other people might think this is, a wonderfully pleasurable activity. And if you're not careful, you can be very patrician. You can say, we know what's best for you, and prescribe what everyone has to do. Well, preference utilitarianism wants to kind of leave people more to have their own free choices. But and this is the important point for Singer, in his practical ethics, he wants to extend the groups that are included in the consideration of the sum total of preferences, and they would incorporate animals now, non-human animals, particularly the great apes, who were typically experimented on for medical purposes in quite trivial ways in the past, and as a result of Singer's activism, that's now no longer the case. Animals are not used in cosmetic testing in the EU, and if you want to get a license to experiment on higher primates, you're going to need to show that you're going to make significant breakthroughs medically to get a license to do that. So we should take account of the preferences of animals because they suffer. We equally should not take account of people who or non-persons, those in comas or late-stage Alzheimer's patients or fetuses. If they're non-persons, then their preferences, if they haven't been stated in a living will, if they foresee circumstances in which they will not be compos mentis, then their preferences would be made instead by their next of kin. So there are important ways in which preference utilitarianism can be used to highlight the interests and the preferences of groups that have often been excluded, particularly animals. And that was a merit of preference utilitarianism, as was this kind of non-patrician approach of preference utilitarianism. It doesn't presume to know what people ought to be doing. It leaves that up to them. They're adults after all. This is the big point, right? In 2014, Peter Singer changed his mind. He shifted from being a preference utilitarian, in which he'd been most of his life. He wrote a book called The Point of View of the Universe, and he became a hedonic utilitarian. He shifted back to Mill's and Bentham's kind of position that there is a degree of objectivity. And he said those who defend subjectivism in ethics are on the back foot. And he thinks that suffering is an ontological fact in the universe. In this respect, animals are equal, they suffer. And he's been persuaded by Henry Sidgwick, who's the third great utilitarian and perhaps the greatest of the three, Bentham, Mill, and Sidgwick. He is, according to Singer, the greatest. And Sidgwick believed that there were certain axiomatic principles, self-evident principles, like I ought not to do to you what you wouldn't want I ought not to do to you what I wouldn't want you to do to me. And everyone's interests are to count equally. He thought those were obvious points. Now, some people might say, well, there's no way you can have any objective morality because, evolutionary development has shaped us to survive, not to think rationally. But he wants to argue that taking the point of view of the universe, trying to be impartial, is stepping aside from our self-interest, and it is taking a more balanced and sane point of view. In a Darwinian left, he wants to argue that we have the capacity in our evolutionary psychology to be cooperative as well as competitive, and we should develop this because if we think globally, we can find solutions to global problems like the environment or coronavirus, or how to deal with overdependence on antibiotics, which are going to have no effect in the future if we don't reduce use on them. Some solutions, like international law solutions on the International Criminal Court to prosecute war crimes and so on, can only be found globally. And so Singer thinks that we should not be depressed at the thought that we are just evolutionary survival machines. Far from it. We can reason, we can adopt a more impartial point of view and see the importance of our cooperative nature. But his shift towards objectivism is important for another reason. If you're a practical ethicist and you're talking to some egoist, someone who just says, I'm out for me, I don't care anything about the environment, I don't care anything about the bottom billion in the world or people suffering from malaria, I'm just in it for me, and that's my philosophy of life. Well, preference utilitarianism doesn't give you much of a leverage on that person. You can't really persuade them to change their mind and their lifestyle. Whereas hedonic utilitarianism can say you're wrong because other people's pain counts equally to yours, and you have the capacity out of your luxury and excess income to give to the bottom billion. The Against Malaria Foundation reckons that $3,340 is enough to save a life. If you have that spare change, then you ought to give it. That's utilitarians. That's Singer's hedonic argument, and it's a stronger argument from the point of view of hedonic utilitarianism than it is from preference utilitarianism. So I think that's one of the practical reasons why he's made this shift, that it enables him to gain more purchase over Western consumers who don't want to throw up their money or give away their money. This does lead to the problem of demandingness. In other words, where does this stop? If you're responsible for what you don't do as well as what you do, then every time you decide not to give away $3,340, are you effectively killing someone whose death could have been prevented if you'd given it to the Anti-Malaria Foundation? For that matter, we all have 2 kidneys. So am I obliged to give away one of my kidneys in a transplant and save somebody's life? I'd still live with a very high percentage chance of having the same length of life I would normally have. So am I not obliged under this logic to give away my kidney? Someone actually who read an article by Singer went and gave away one of their kidneys for that very reason. So who knows, it could persuade people. Then there's welfare utilitarianism. And this is saying that, it's a bit more patrician, this. It's saying that we live in a world where people's choices are shaped by marketing and their upbringing and their environment. They may have been brought up in a childhood with an appalling diet with loads of kind of Coke and carbohydrates and McDonald's takeaways, and so that's what their preferences are. They may have been brought up in an environment where education was devalued, there were no books in the household, and that they just watch TV and play games, and that's what they prefer. Well, welfare utilitarianism says that states have a duty to provide necessary resources to help people help themselves, as it were. Health, money, shelter. There should be, we have a welfare state which provides a kind of safety net, a kind of basic provision of social care for particularly the marginalized, with a redistributive tax system. And this is important because welfare utilitarianism says the poor, or those who are often marginalized, are not making choices that are wise and will help them to thrive and flourish. And this is, as I said, paternalistic. We know what's good for you, goes against Mill's idea that in terms of adults, the harm principle is overriding. You let them do what they want. You don't intervene in their lives, except if they're children or they're very vulnerable. That's the beauty. Freedom is the seedbed of genius, and we don't want to override that. So there are problems here with that. If we take people's freedom away from them, that's a problem. So there are lots of different varieties of utilitarianism there for you to consider. They're not all compatible with one another, and that's again something that you'll have to consider. The one that we haven't looked at there is interest utilitarianism, but you've got a good idea of most of the others. And hopefully this will help you to think through some of the tensions in utilitarianism and some of the ways in which it's been incredibly adaptive over the centuries since Bentham first conceived it. And remember that it is the language of the modern state. You know, when you are at discussions at the Treasury or at the cabinet meeting, this is what's going on. It's a form of utilitarianism that decides how our taxes are spent, that tries to optimize or maximize some form of the greatest good of the greatest number, the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Hopefully in the posts we can have a discussion of this at some length later.